Hi, I'm Dorothy Espelage from the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, and for 22 years I've been studying bullying, sexual violence, teen dating violence, school-based interventions and prevention programs, and today I want to share just a little bit of information about what we've learned over the last 22 years, and so hopefully this will be informative. Certainly we have a short period of time to talk about those 2 decades of research, and clearly it's only going to be the tip of the iceberg, right? But hopefully that you'll take away some lessons learned, some things that you might be doing that really is not evidence-based and may not prevent bullying in your classroom or in your schools. But maybe also you'll take away some things that would reduce bullying in your schools. So we've been at this for 2 decades, and certainly, you know, you see me presenting on this, but there's 35 PhD students, thousands of undergrads that help us do this work, and some really brave superintendents and teachers that have let us come into their classrooms to understand bullying and all the other things it's associated with. So we've done a host of studies. So we've done studies where we just do basic research and identify what are the risk and protective factors associated with bullying and sexual violence and teen dating violence, all of those things that unfortunately happens in our schools. But we've also then took those findings, whether they're identifying risk and protective factors, those things that really make kids resilient, and have developed and evaluated actual prevention programs that we would ask teachers to implement. And so we'll talk about that today. But one thing is very, very important, because in 2011, when Obama had the first White House conference on bullying, yes, 2011, so we're a little bit behind there, what happened was there was this raising of awareness of bullying, and everybody was talking about bullying as if we understood things. And what happens when the media covers it is that you're left with misperceptions, right? So some myths, if you will. So we're all on the same page so that you understand that the media has kind of told you some things that are not kind of grounded in science and is not supported by the research. I thought I'd just kind of put those all out there for you. First, there's a sense, because of the raising of awareness, that bullying is an epidemic, that it's everywhere, that somehow it just emerged. The reality is that bullying rates have varied. They have gone down in some affluent, high-resource schools. The rates have gone up in other places where violence is just the norm, but certainly we do know that there are some kids that go to schools where there's not bullying. It doesn't happen in their schools. Is it a public health concern? Certainly it is. I think the association with some adverse outcomes for kids that are chronically victimized, but it is a public health concern, but I don't think it as an epidemic is really going to be useful. Also, there's this notion that when parents hear that their kids are being bullied, they instantly think of suicide. So the media has done a really good job of putting that in our head. There's a connection that's almost automatic, unfortunately, when parents hear that. What we do know is the media covers bullying prevention 80% of the time. It's a suicide story. 10% of the time it's legislation, and 10% it's prevention. So clearly the media needs to be more positive and not highlight and create this panic. There's also this notion that bullies are kind of budding criminals. In reality, in the developmental psychology literature, that we know that there's 2 types of kids that engage in high rates of bullying. We do have that kind of Hollywood depiction thug bully that's kind of what we call the ineffective aggressor. This ineffective aggressor doesn't have high social capital, and actually kids will turn this ineffective aggressor bully in, if you will. The other 50% is what we call a kind of Machiavellian bully. Those are the kids that have high social capital. They might have heightened theory of mind. They know when to turn this behavior on and off. And they're actually very popular, overrepresented in athletic groups. For many of the principals in the room, you will never see those kids turned in and come into your office. So you need to recognize that the kids that you are seeing are those that are the ineffective aggressor, and you're only getting to about 50% of them. There's also this notion that somehow 3 strikes you're out, you engage in bullying, that we need to punish you. And this is unfortunate because the developmental literature shows that, 1, we have the Machiavellian bully, but we also know that a lot of this behavior comes from the social context. So if you have teachers that bully one another and you're modeling that behavior, kids will kind of display that behavior as well. We can't take a punitive approach, right? 1, we already have disparities in expulsions and suspensions for some groups, especially within the United States. But we certainly do know if we take a punitive approach, it's not going to be a fair approach. Then, another one is this idea that bullies come from dysfunctional families. So I've already explained to you that Machiavellian bully, right? So those kids can come from intact families, in fact, where it's very kind of pro-social. So kids, if it works for them, if they're popular and that's how they maintain their social capital, then certainly they can come from very functional families. And the last one just emerged last year was in the media, and this was the idea that bullying is hardwired. So there was a social scientist from Canada that surveyed 123 kids in Canada and didn't really assess any kind of biological markers or genetic predisposition, and argued that bullying is hardwired. Certainly we do know that we can reduce bullying, especially if we focus on the social context, and certainly it's not hardwired. You know, if you spend some time, many of you are in schools and you're thinking to yourself, they call everything bullying, so much so that bullying doesn't really have a meaning anymore. I think that that is a problem. I think that some parents, even when kids are, you know, not nice to one another, they don't want to be one another's friends anymore, we call it bullying. Certainly we do need to assess that, but at the same time we do have an understanding from social science. We believe how bullying differs from other peer aggression and peer conflict. And so what happened in the United States is a number of years ago, the Centers for Disease Control and the Department of Education got together and convened a panel of experts to say, what is bullying? And we started with the definition that we adopted many decades ago from Norway and Dan Olweus's pioneering work. And then we looked to the social science literature. And essentially bullying is unwanted aggressive behavior among school-aged children that has a high likelihood of causing physical or psychological harm. So this is not normal peer conflict, but there's some components that are important in that there has to be an imbalance of real or perceived power. And power could be social status, size, the amount of money that you have, the clothes that you wear, whether or not you're in an athletic group versus a non-athletic group. So there has to be a power differential. It also, you'll hear that it has to be repeated, or a high likelihood that it would be repeated. Many of you know that when kids are victimized, they change their behavior. They stop riding the bus, they drop out of sport, they may not go to lunch, they may eat their lunch in a bathroom stall. And so if you're waiting for it to happen again, unfortunately you're not recognizing the social science literature that kids do something different when this happens. But we do know that kids that are chronically victimized, that there are really kind of long-term negative consequences. Recent longitudinal developmental literature has shown that kids that are chronically victimized 30 years later will have a major depressive disorder or generalized anxiety disorder as adults. Now, when we think about the kids that engage in high rates of bullying, what are their long-term effects? We really don't know. What we do know is that they're not likely to have a psychiatric disorder, but they're likely to have what we call antisocial traits, and that they just they're rule breakers, if you will. Okay, so that's the definition. Now, what we tried to do in an experimental study is to show is in fact are these components really important? And here you'll see the slide. This is an article that was published in the Journal of Adolescent Health, and I have more text on here just mostly so that you could, when you go back to this PowerPoint, that you can actually see what we found. Essentially what we found is the more of those components that are present, the more adverse outcomes you have, more daily interference. So if in fact there is a power differential, it's repeated, and I feel that I cannot defend myself and I feel helpless, you'll have the highest rates of daily interference. So what does this mean for you? So when kids come to you and say, I'm being bullied, now remember, they have to tell us what it is, because bullying doesn't really mean anything, right? The kid's not thinking repeated power imbalance. They're thinking they won't let me sit at that lunch table, or they're taking my money, because extortion still happens in schools. So you ask as a teacher, as a practitioner, you say, what's happening? Then you ask, how long has it been happening? And do they feel that they can defend themselves? And do they feel that they have someone to turn to? If they tell you that it feels like there is a power imbalance, they can't defend themselves, it's been going on for a long time, which, by the way, most of the time, by the time to come to you, it has been going on for a really long time. And if they feel that they don't have any external support, no one to turn to, then you must do a screening, a psychiatric screening ASAP. If you have all those components, because we've shown that as you have the increase in those components in the definition, the more interference you will have over time. Okay, so when we think about this, okay, so people still kind of say, is it a big deal? Well, it is. So when we look at our national data, when we look at international data, consistently we find in 3rd through 8th graders, 15% of the kids are chronically victimized, and I'm talking about like 60 times in a month. So I'm not talking about once in a lifetime. That in fact, over the month, 60 incidents, 15%. We have 17% of those kids that are kind of what we call the ringleader bullies. So those are the ones that are leading the social groups and kind of driving this behavior. 8% are your bully victims. These kids that are victimized that become aggressive themselves. And what we find for this particular group, they have the worst mental health profiles. So if you have a kid that you're working with and you notice like 1 year they're victimized and then you see that they're aggressive, you should be very, very concerned. Social workers, school psychologists, we all recognize that this is the most at-risk group. So you add those numbers up and it's clearly that 40% of our student population is involved as a bully perpetrator, victim, or a bully victim. But the reality is the remaining 60% are standing around, either contributing to it or hoping that the bully group doesn't turn on them. And so it is this notion that we have to think about our interventions not as pulling out the kid that engages in bullying or just taking care of the victim. Actually, we have to take care of all of these different roles that kids play. What we do know, though, and there's this big notion now of bystander empowerment and bystander revolution, and we'll talk a little bit more about this. There is a science that's developing around who intervenes and who doesn't intervene, but it's very, very clear that interventions need to focus on this 60%, because we know that when you ask kids if they intervene, only 13% actually would intervene to help a victim.